Welcome to the first episode of the new year with an extremely emotional Ukrainian. That's Lesia Dubenko, and I know she has a lot of stuff to get off her chest. We're going to dive in. It's very early in January, but already so much has happened. Lesia, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, what are we going to talk about today? Because there are so many things going on, and so much has happened since we last spoke. It seems that the neighbor of Ukraine has not, they didn't just get down to unwrapping their presents under the Christmas tree. They've been inflicting their usual round of misery and missiles and trauma and projected trauma onto other people. What specifically do you think we should prioritize in our discussion?
I think we should talk a little bit about the interview that everybody's buzzing about, and that is President Zelensky and Lex Fridman, or Alexei, his name is.
Alexei Frolov, is that his name?
No, I think he said that Frolov is his mother's like my mother's maiden's name, but he's Friedman and Alexei Friedman.
Yeah. Well, let's dive in because I managed to got my hands on full transcript using AI. I'm going through it in fine detail. So far, I get the impression that Zelensky has come out with some of his strongest and clearest and actually most emotional answers. But I'm sure you have something to say about the quality of the questioning.
Actually, the way I view Friedman is it's not about the quality. Okay, so he represents a certain kind of train of thought, let's put it that way, right? So some people would say that this is a KGB asset. I'm not 100% sure because I've seen so many and I've met so many people like Friedman in life that you can't literally say that all of them are KGB assets. It's just it's just a certain train of thought. And today, for this reason, actually, I thought of my late grandma, which it thinks very much like Lex Fridman. It's the same kind of train of thought. So let's start with Zelensky and his performance in general. I think it was indeed one of his best interviews, and I think one of the reasons why it was one of his best interviews is precisely because Friedman speaks Russian. So it turns out because okay, he didn't reply in Russian. Occasionally he replied something in Russian. I didn't like watch all 3 hours, but I could hear him like reply in Russian every now and again. And it did him well because, interpretation, and I know this for a fact. I was an interpreter once, also, like even twice during events, is a massive turnoff during interviews. It's a huge and massive turnoff. It disrupts your train of thought, it disrupts your flow, and you can it's not the same dynamic. So because he could understand Friedman, and I'm sure that Friedman, despite saying that he didn't understand anything in Ukrainian, he understood. It's like definitely he understood. He understood the emotion, he understood the tone. He comes from a society with the same kind of emotional level of understanding things. So it did him well because this is the kind of environment that Zelensky feels comfortable in. Because then he can emotionally answer and he can be honest. And you could see that there was a lot of honesty in responses regarding Minsk agreements, regarding Bucharest summit, when he didn't hold back. He exactly named who's responsible, and we all know who's responsible for that failed. Her name is Angela Merkel, and she is responsible for many of the things we see today. And we must not forget that because just recently she released a book called Freiheit, right? Freedom.
The
Freedom from
irony, yeah.
what? Yeah, freedom from what? I'm sorry. Like, because you actually spend what, more than a decade building up your country's dependency on Russian gas and Russian fossil fuels. Is that what you call freedom?
Maybe that's the subtitle, freedom from large gas bills. Maybe that's what it should
Yeah,
have been called.
okay. Yeah. Freedom from large gas bills, freedom from well, not sanity, but the general understanding of geopolitics, let's put it that way. So I think this is one of the reasons language, actually the lack of language barrier is what did Zelensky good. So despite some of my compatriots being very angry that Friedman asked for that, I thought it was actually good because this way you can receive responses with different quality and are not like robotic. You know what I mean? It's like, you just like sit there with these your eyes and you like think to yourself, yeah, I'm gonna answer and then I'm gonna wait for this person to interpret and then I'm gonna be like, because well, Zelensky's English is poor. He's not able to communicate like, like myself and so some of my colleagues who are super fluent. And this
And
matters.
it really
Okay.
contrasts,
The
doesn't
language,
it?
yeah.
Because he's an incredibly articulate man. He's humorous, and there's a
As a
certain sort
comedian,
of
obviously.
rhythm and music to his language. Which, of course, as you say, comedians have that. It's part of their skill set. The timing, the choice of words. So actually, yeah, speaking in Russian plays to his core skills. But I can see why politically the optics are not necessarily great for Zelensky to be speaking Russian. But early on in the interview, he made a really fantastic comment. He said, "Look, I did my first interview of the full-scale war in Russian because I wanted to address the Russian people. And what was the result? Nothing. Zip. Nada. Totally mute." I think that was a great point to make early on.
And that is indeed one of the reasons why he switched to Ukrainian, right? So that was a good decision to switch to Ukrainian regardless, because like I said, I don't buy the fact that Friedman did not understand what was said. Some parts, sure. But like the general kind of context, he understood perfectly well. He doesn't look like an idiot to me. And so overall, what I really liked about this interview is that, it had a goal, it had an objective. And the primary objective, and this was something that was confirmed to me by Zelensky's office, it's not just something I made up on my own during Christmas holidays or something. It was confirmed to me that Zelensky and like personally and generally like Kiev, official Kiev, wants to reach new audiences, especially those who are influenced by Trump, by MAGA, by different things. Because I think I mentioned this before, but like, MAGA audience, just like any audience out there, just like any group out there, isn't something homogeneous, right? There are people obviously who are like these hardcore isolationists and they don't want anything to do with anyone and they only want to focus on border or something else, which is obviously like, their right to do so. But what I mean is that there are a lot of among MAGA people, there are people who like, they're not like pro-Ukraine in the sense of carrying a Ukrainian flag with them, but they're sympathetic. They understand the situation. They understand the implications. They hate the Biden administration. They hate Democrats in general. They hate the legacy media. That's the worst thing. It's like, I actually saw it once, like in real life. I was talking to a guy and he turned out to be pro-Trump. It was like kind of like, very obvious. And the word that triggered him the most in the conversation wasn't Ukraine, Zelensky, or something else. Not even Biden. It was CNN. That's it. That was the conversation was over. Like because the moment you mention CNN, some of these people go crazy because they hate it so much. And I don't want to say that CNN anchors or CNN journalists are like bad or super bad, but they are extremely biased. So, if you want a different opinion or you want a different optics, CNN is not going to provide you with that. And
This is the challenge, isn't it? Is to sort of scream that the other guy is biased, the other guy's intentions are wrong, etc., etc. That is to ignore the fact that many of the people who are screaming that are in their own kind of political bubble, unwilling to listen to any alternative points of view. So it's people sort of pointing the fingers at each other, refusing to listen to each other, refusing to modulate their tone, to go to other sources, to question their own assumptions. I mean, it's a systemic problem. It's not just a sort of a left-right thing.
it's not just a systemic problem. I was actually quite shocked. I mean, I think I said this before, but I'm going to just repeat it. I don't take a very strong interest in American politics in general. This is something recent because, like, for me, the US politics was never super interesting. I know a lot of people who love it. I was like always kind of neutral toward it. Okay, yeah. I mean, I know stuff about it, but I'm not like emotionally invested. I don't watch CNN. I don't watch MSNBC. I don't watch this. I don't want that. Watch that. But because of the situation, I had to watch some of the things, and honestly, I saw some footage of election night by CNN, MSNBC, and somebody else. I don't remember right now. Well, I mean, if you call this objective, then what is propaganda in a way? I'm sorry to ask.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, there's that, and then there's keeping quiet, and there's a whole spectrum, I think, of bias, which is interesting to note. And you can have the sort of screaming bias that we're talking about, but then there's the sort of silent bias, which is happening more and more in British media, which is, there are certain topics that you feel you cannot discuss from any angle. So you just sort of, you drift over them and you move on to something else that you feel, one, is not going to be so contentious, or that is not going to anger the people who are paying the bills. And I think that's very dangerous, to be modulating what you're prepared to analyze and discuss, because of the sources of funding for media. That includes the BBC. They don't upset, left and right too much, because ultimately, they'll have more controls and more bureaucracy imposed on them, and more limitations. Let's turn back to the thing, because I think this is really fascinating. And I'm one who would say, like you, that Lex Fridman, he fits into the propagandist universe because he adopts certain mechanics which I think are beneficial to Moscow, but that does not make him an asset. And as you say, the thing about sort of those who grew up in the Soviet Union, especially Russians who haven't shaken off, the Russification or Sovietization of their mindset, they are radically depoliticized, which means they really struggle to think strategically and think politically. And I think you can have someone like Lex Fridman who can play a role in the informational hybrid warfare without himself actually realizing he's doing that, because his point of view seems to be so naive, seems to be naive to the point where everybody, it doesn't conceive of the idea that people can be ill-intentioned and that they can act in extreme self-interest and yet use language which is, claiming to be something other. How, does this fit then, you see it with some of the Russians you speak to, but again, not necessarily regime assets. They may even say that they are very much against, Putin's regime, and yet, if you dig deeper, there's a lack of sort of strategic analysis in their thinking, and this seems to me comes out in Friedman's questioning as well.
Listen, I mean, I don't know Friedman's precise biography. When did he immigrate to the US?
He's pretty young, I
90s?
think.
He
And
was
also, he didn't necessarily live continuously in Moscow. I think he was in, according to the interview, was it Kazakhstan or somewhere?
I think he was born in Uzbekistan or
It was,
something. He
yeah,
lived in
something like that.
Moscow. He lived in Moscow. He's
Yeah,
Jewish, from what I understand, right? So it was one of the waves of
yeah.
immigration. So these people are part of their bubble. Don't forget, like people who live in New York, Brighton Beach, a lot of them are pro-Putin and they sympathize. They think like Friedman, more or less, because they're part of this bubble. It's extremely difficult to understand this. It's extremely difficult to decouple yourself from
Yeah.
this, especially if you have family in Russia. And especially, I heard this interview where he was talking about Putin being a humble man when he was like, well,
I
look,
mean, no, not
no,
actually,
I mean,
no.
he
He's
was
not
no,
a
but
humble man at
listen.
all. Yeah.
Okay, the only thing I can agree with him is that at the beginning, Putin seemed to be a little bit better. Okay, yeah, he was a little bit better. Yeah, generally, let's
If you
put it that way.
ignore, how
Yeah, if you
he
ignore,
got to
but
where
it's like by
he,
Russian standards, what do you expect from Russia? But I also heard when he was saying, like when he was talking about the 90s, it was something that bothered him and most probably his family because Friedman is what, an MIT something? He's a tech guy, right? Most likely
I think
his
physics
family
or
was.
something, isn't
Hmm?
it? It's got a science background, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, if that's the case, most likely his family is also from that background. And imagine what it was like in the 90s to have to be like a scientific guy in Russia. All of them immigrated because there was no money. There was no money. There was nothing to do. There was penniless people. They were like, at best, those who were like a little bit talented, they went into trade, they did something like that. My late grandma, who was also like, was like a professor, even though she was like not a super great professor in economy, but still she had like a degree and stuff. In the 90s, she would go to Poland to sell lingerie, let's put it that way, right? So those were the days. Some people made it, some people didn't make it, but a lot were like, they harbor this grudge
They do.
because they don't
Yeah.
understand. They don't understand because to them, the 90s was like sold as democracy, as liberalism. This is democracy, this is liberalism. But in fact, it turned out to be wild capitalism.
Yeah.
Like, like
I mean, let's
capitalism at
also, because
work.
people will put their own kind of frameworks on this, but I think there's something interesting here. One is, and I heard these conversations for everyone, if this is your democracy, I don't think much of it. And yet, every time I heard this conversation for people, I'd be like, what are you doing personally in politics? Oh no, I don't believe in politics. I don't get involved in politics. So there is no democracy if you don't have at least a percentage of the population participating in a democratic process and developing sort of, let's say, political behaviors, even joining parties or whatever. But there's this radical depoliticization. On the one hand, democracy, great. Oh dear, not working. But are you individually doing anything to push that democracy forward? No, almost nobody was in the 90s. So radically disenfranchised from politics. And what you mentioned there, people immediately think, oh, the 90s, and they'll think about it materially. Well, it was materially tough for everybody, but not everybody nurses these intense grievances. I think you've hit on
Most.
something here. It's those who have a
Most.
loss of status. Yeah, but a lot of people move on or whatever. But I think the worst or the deepest sense of grievance is those who are actually of higher status in the sort of, Soviet aristocracy. They may not have been well paid necessarily as professors, but they had a sort of certain status in society. So it's those who lost that status that I think nurse the greatest grievances. And
Oh,
that's kind of important.
yeah, yeah, no, no, for sure. You're absolutely right because, before 1991, they were somebody, and then the next day they woke up and they're nobody. It hurts. It kind of hurts. So, from a human perspective, it's just something that will not go away anywhere soon. So, this has to go through several generations. Again, I'm not here to defend Alexei Friedman, but I'm here to like just give you a little bit of a perspective because I talked about this before that it's very important to understand where like how Russian propaganda operates and it's general psyops. It identifies every person out there and what they're worried about and problems, and they amplify them. They use them, they amplify them. They don't create them
It's the
because
politics of
yeah,
grievance, isn't it?
yes,
And
yes. Because, like, for example, Friedman, I heard that, oh, he brought up the corruption, he brought up a presidential election, it's like all these Russian po talking points. How are these Russian talking points? I'm sorry to like I understand that Russia does amplify them, of course, weaponizes them, yes. But is corruption in Ukraine something that Russia invented? Or yeah, the lack of the lack of presidential elections, which is contentious, and this is something that bothers a lot of Republicans, even pro-Ukraine Republicans, like blatantly pro-Ukraine Republicans. They are concerned about this, and this is something that people who work there tell me, like in different institutions who are Ukraine's friends. So this is not talking points. It was like, Russia said, Alexei, here is like, you need to ask this and you need to ask that. This is ridiculous. Okay. This is ridiculous. If that was the case, because these things exist. And the fact that Zelensky was able to push back and explain and, he wasn't, um, this is exactly the kind of interview that where people are not asking you questions. Excuse me, sir. Which ice cream do you prefer? Is it strawberry or vanilla? Or, another, okay. Another question for you, sir. Are you awesome or great? Let's have a discussion about that. This is not the kind of interview that it was, and that's good because I believe that part of the problem in the West, for example, and what happened during the presidential election in the US as well, and not just in the US, like generally, is that politicians started to avoid everyone who'd ask them tough questions.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
and if you don't answer tough questions, then what do you expect,
Mm.
right? Like Kamala Harris, she wasn't asked a single tough question, even though there were lots of questionable things when it comes to her
And she
policy.
stayed away from those forums where she thought
Exactly.
she may
Yeah.
be
She
asked tough
didn't she didn't
questions.
attend Joe Rogan's podcast. She was invited. She didn't attend because somebody told her not to attend because probably she wasn't able. She didn't feel, right? She didn't feel that she was capable enough to push back, even if you're asked something you dislike. So obviously, Zelensky was asked questions that he did not like, and he pushed back, especially when Friedman said about Putin loving his people and Putin loving his country. And he told him immediately, like, dude, what are you talking about? People who love their country, they actually care about the country, right? And the people who live there. And you don't send your 18-year-old children or like, boys, so well, not girls in this case, boys, to die in
Yeah.
Ukraine for what? For
And this is
land, for your
really interesting.
power?
I've noticed this as well in some Russians of my acquaintance in the UK, and specifically those who were brought up in the Baltics as let's say how it is. They're the colonists. They're brought up in a country where they are the colonizers, but don't see themselves as such. They see it as their absolute right to live in those places and to not have any limits on their sort of rights and privileges, which is a very imperial attitude. But in many people, it's unconscious, unfortunately, and that accusation could be leveled at all sorts of people who are non-Russian as well. So, this isn't just a Russian problem. And if they've never spent any time in the sort of, the Russian mothership, as it were, the motherland, but they've lived on that periphery in slightly more privileged communities and, the colonist communities, or they've spent a very short time in their adolescence and then moved away, they will have one foot in that informational bubble, but they won't have the direct experience. They won't know the actual Moscow rules. They won't be able to say, okay, this is the propagandistic fantasy, and either I'm going to, amplify it or not. And then in their head, they'll also know, and this is the reality, and I can compartmentalize it, or I can make the conscious choice to kind of light the world and myself. They don't actually have this. So I think partly they buy into this mythologized version of Russia. They probably haven't traveled around the provinces, especially, and seen what it's really like and what contempt Russian leaders actually have for their own people.
Oh, obviously, because they only think about Moscow and St. Petersburg, maybe some other cities like that. Because when you talk about Russia, when a Westerner talks about Russia, like she talks about two cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, nothing else. That's it. Because in Moscow, have you seen the subway in Moscow? Whoa, what? Whoa, that's just amazing. And have you seen the
I mean,
palace?
it is a nice subway, I mean,
It's a nice sub.
there's
Nobody's
not a bad
like the
subway. It's
thing is the
clean. It
thing is that
works.
nobody's like I'm not saying that it's not nice. It's actually nice. I admit it. But how do you use that information? Just
Yeah.
because the subway is nice, it means what?
And
Like
also
what's the logical
context.
sequence here? What's the logical sequence? If you have a nice subway, this means what? What does it mean? It means nothing. It means that it was built during the Soviet Union and
Yeah.
subways were like, one of the main public places for people to travel around and like, Soviet architecture. It was
But it also
quite.
lacks historical context, which is
Mhm.
really important because something like a fifth of historic Moscow was bulldozed to build the subway. You think of all about the lives, the culture, the identities that were just sort of bulldozed on a dictatorial whim. And it's the same as St. Petersburg. You think of the facades and the beautiful palaces on the river. Well, I'm sorry, but hundreds of thousands of people died in a malarial swamp to build a fantasy of a dictator. The fact that it looks pretty, if you don't look at the full holistic context of that, then you're really sort of missing something of the story there.
I've never been to Russia. I must admit, I've never been there. Like St. Petersburg, Moscow. I wanted to go to St. Petersburg once, but somehow, the concept of subways being nice in Moscow isn't enough to
Not enough of yeah.
entice me. Yeah, to entice me. I must be honest, I guess I'm a primitive, simple girl, and Italy attracts me slightly more than Russia. But it's like, um, what I'm trying to say here is that regardless even of how it was built, because a lot of things that happened back in the day were like, dubious worldwide in terms of how things were done and built. Regardless of that, even though obviously in Russia everything's done on a whim, right? And it's like, you have a dictator, you had Khrushchev who wanted to suddenly corn, he fell in love with corn, he went to the US and like, saw the cornfields and something and decided that it's time to like, plant it everywhere. Why? What for? It was never explained because because it's how it works. It's how it works in countries like these. And regardless of that, it's just that if we come back to Friedman and the way he thinks, it's not about being naive. It's not about he is part of the bubble he was raised in and he's still exposed to, despite living in the West, despite everything. It's like pretty much like Brighton Beach in New York. It's like I actually even saw videos like it's still the 90s atmosphere there. There's still these émigrés who left Russia and so on. They live in this bubble, and I think that he's kind of part of that bubble. His family there, he's exposed to that sentiment. You don't need to you don't need to be a KGB asset to say things like he says. Because if he were to be like a pure KGB asset, he would never let Zelensky relay all the messages he
Yes, that's
received.
true. And he
Exactly.
wouldn't have interviewed Serhiy because I know people have made a big play of the fact that yes, he does have a lot of right-wing talking heads. He doesn't properly, I think, sort of challenge falsehoods. That's because it's his style, but also think he lacks the context sometimes to do that. But I don't think a full Kremlin asset would do a 3 hour interview with Sergei, for instance. That
Yeah,
wouldn't happen because
right.
it would be
I,
outside of
I,
their.
I don't think so. And the way I saw it's not like because a lot of people said that he will edit it the way to make Zelensky look bad. He didn't edit out a single thing.
No, he doesn't.
And yes, and even now when he was criticized because of some slap on the wrist mistranslation that happened, he said they're gonna correct it. So he's pretty like
Yeah,
responsible and responsive, right? Because trust me, a lot of media outlets would ignore that altogether.
yeah.
Like, oh yeah, we made a mistake. Who cares? We're so great and you're not.
And
And
that's
like
that's a linguistic slip, which is quite easy to understand how that happens. It's actually quite nuanced language. So, I don't see intentionality behind
and
that.
to be
And he
honest, I
doesn't
sympathize.
interrupt either,
Yeah.
which is good.
Yeah, and plus I sympathize was what he said at the beginning when he was talking about interpreters and the quality of interpretation was poor.
Yeah.
The reason why I sympathize with that is because like I said, I was an interpreter once. I'm not a trained interpreter. I can do it sometimes. But I got some feedback from people who actually they were in a room with some OSCE representatives, and those representatives provided them with the interpreters, and it's like it was hell. It
Yeah.
was so bad. It was so bad. So interpreters, like really skilled ones, wow, they're like, I don't know, there are very few of them out there.
Even
And
then, it does interrupt the flow. I mean, I'm entirely sympathetic with what he said. Even the very best interpreters, it's going to sound quite stilted. It's going to interrupt the flow. It's going to create gaps, and you lose energy of the conversation during that. So I can absolutely appreciate that. I mean, we don't have too much time. What I wanted to, because you've obviously spoken to the Zelensky's Kiev office and people there, you understand, why that interview was done, actually why that's important, why potentially getting the Joe Rogan one, I think is incredibly important for that to happen. As much as I do not like a lot of the content Rogan produces, I do think some of his guests are rather interesting, and I again wouldn't label him a Kremlin asset, but I think that's an important one to happen. If this interview is a stepping stone towards that one, I think that is really critical. But what do you think will be the impact, or what is the intent that Zelensky's office had behind the interview, and do you think they will have achieved it?
Okay, so two things. There is a rule in communication, in comms in general, public comms and strategic communication. If there's a communication gap of any kind, it's either you fill it or somebody else will fill it for you. There's absolutely no other way. So this is something you have to keep in mind. You don't choose, I mean, unless the person is like, I wouldn't talk to Jackson Hinkle. I would avoid it, but because they're different, like there's a different reason why, right? Jackson Hinkle is a totally different person. He is a blatant asset. It's like this, there's nothing to discuss there. When it comes to Joe Rogan, well, he's popular. He was popular before that. Like, he's, I don't really know much about him. I just know that he's big. And a lot of things that he gets is obviously like, from the more conservative circles, or from, let's not even call them non-conservative. I would call them anti-leftist woke legacy media, something like, this whole mix, because this is apparently the biggest issue in the US right now, is that like what is woke, what is not woke, and somehow Ukraine got trapped in that. Apparently, I was told, I was shocked, wanted to hear that somehow Ukraine is labeled among some conservative commentators woke and progressive. Like, have you seen Ukraine? Guys, come on, this is a little bit ridiculous. It's a pretty conservative society in general. It's like how did we get there, like mixed up in this whole story? I have no idea. But okay, it happened somehow. So the reason why this specific Friedman interview was done, this is according to Zelensky, is because we need to target Trump's audiences, right? Trump is going to be in office for the next 4 years. It's a fact. So, we can whine about it. We can, I mean, a lot of people actually don't whine about it. So, but I'm just saying that, like, a lot of people in Ukraine are pro-Trump. And they were pro-Trump before Biden. So, but actually, Trump's administration, the first Trump's administration in Ukraine, was a pretty popular one. Like, it was perceived well. I wouldn't say that there was much happiness when Biden won the election, but it's not up to us. I'm just saying that it's not something that is like, a tragedy, that was viewed as a tragedy at all. A lot of people in Ukraine are pro-Trump. And somehow we need to communicate this, because he's going to be in office. And during the past 2 years, the communication line with the conservatives was poor, right? So it was ignored. Letterman and other people, those are not conservatives. They're nice people, but again, they're associated with the legacy media and with everything that's bad these days, according to the conservative groups. So the primary reason is to establish a better communication with these people, and like, because among conservatives, it's not like, it's not like the conservatives hate Ukraine or something. I think they're a little bit bewildered to some extent, as like, why suddenly are we so pro-Democrat, even though when you come to think of it, the Democratic administrations over the years, like generally, like Clinton, Barack Obama especially, Biden too, in the end, they didn't do much for Ukraine. Mildly put, mildly put. Blinken's interview, for example, with the NYT, where he was, I like Blinken. It's just my personal thing. I like him. Unlike Kamala Harris, for instance, I understand what he did during those years and why he did. Okay, so I give him credit for a lot of things that were good. Some were not, but I don't think that he was like, the one deciding there these things. But what I'm trying to say is that still in his interview with the NYT, he was like, like it was just self-praise, self-praise and how amazing they did and so on. And I'm like, yeah, where it was like, dude, if you did so well, how come the war is still around? And people in Ukraine are extremely pro-Trump, according to some new survey. Like most Trump positive nation in Europe. Like, haha. Does that indicate that you did well? I doubt that. So we want to talk to the conservative audience. I don't think that Ukraine hates the Democrats or something like, or the progressives in general. No, we don't. But at the same time, we are not some kind of like, internal politics bargaining chip where Ukraine's issue in general is owned by the Democrats. Like, no, this isn't so. So this is something that we want to like, communicate, and Zelensky wants to communicate too. And once I'm sure that if a ceasefire takes place, because the more I talk to people, the less belief there is that this will ever happen. Like, because, for example, I'm in the middle of editing an interview with Michael D. Shannon, and he said that, like, come on, like, who is Kella gonna talk to in Moscow? Lavrov, Putin? What is he gonna, like, what kind of, like, messages will he collect from them and so on? He will travel there, that's for sure, right? It's his job to travel there, which is fine. But what kind of like, talking points memo will he bring back to Trump? Oh, give us everything and do everything we say. Why? It's so the
I
more
think
people
that's interesting,
yeah.
isn't it? Because this interview then fits with quite an interesting time. And the timing is critical because it's before this attempt at negotiations. It's before Kellogg's mission has failed. Um, and no, we'll talk about this in future episodes, but it does seem that there are several appointments being lined up, including the new US ambassador to Kiev, who actually understand the region far better than some of these sort of talking heads who annoy us, who are definitely Russian assets. There are some really sort of smart, quite well informed. They wouldn't call them MAGA, but more traditional sort of GOP people who are being lined up, and they're going into this obviously wanting to secure a negotiation. But I think they are knowledgeable enough and cynical enough to know that this is quite a tall order. They see Putin not as Lex Fridman sees him, and this extraordinary sort of naivety and lack of context, but they see him as a former KGB agent. They see him as a dictator. They see him as someone who is, drunk on imperial lust and power. And they're probably going into this hoping for a result, but thinking about what they're going to do if a result isn't achieved. This makes this interview really important because if Zelensky can connect with GOP type people, and then these negotiations fail, well, this is going to play much better for Zelensky. They're not going to immediately turn around and go, well, this all failed because of Zelensky, or this all failed because of Ukraine, or it's 50 of one and 50 of the other, or 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Hopefully these kind of interviews will mean that people look at it and go, well, hang on a second, maybe this Putin guy didn't really want peace after all.
I'm gonna be short. I'm gonna be like super succinct. But listen, Rubio, Marco Rubio, is an extremely good pick for Ukraine. And if you trace what he said, like his statements over the years about Ukraine, they're extremely positive in the sense that he understands the situation. It's not some kind of like it's not Matt Gates, okay? So that's one. Because I don't understand Matt Gates, what his agenda is in general. Like he's just seems to be obnoxious and whatever. Thanks, bye Matt. Anyway, um, the people that Trump chose for these specific positions, I'm still not super happy about Gabbard, but I've heard that she's not going to pass. the chances are so. Um, I think that it shows that he takes this seriously. You know, the pre-electoral talk about 24 hours, this is, you know, elections are elections. During elections, you sell gold, you sell diamonds. No, you don't sell, I'm sorry. You just give it away for free. It's like, you know, you promise that you're going to do all this for free. It's like, it's how elections work, unfortunately. And then after elections, the reality hits and a totally different story emerges. With regard to the conservatives in general understanding who Putin is, well, even like, you know, hardcore conservative commentators like Bill O'Reilly, for example, he calls Putin nothing short of tyrant. You know, he doesn't like, you know, beat around the bush looking for a better word. He calls him tyrant. The question is that they all share, and this is why this whole ceasefire thing is being discussed, is because 3 years into the war, how do you sort of like, you know, because it was managed poorly, let's put it that way, right? Because the weapons were delivered with a delay, 31 Abrams tanks in 2023 to do what? What do you want to do with 31 tanks? Is this a joke? Is this like a poor joke? What's going on? Okay. So if you manage a war like that, at some point you understand that, okay, this party has X amount of resources and this party has Y amount of resources. At the moment, Russia has a lot of resources. I still don't understand, and I don't agree fully. And I have an interview after that with actually an American official who says that, okay, Russia should want a ceasefire. To me, this is not so obvious why it would want to be ceasefire if it has access, like Zelensky said, that North Korea sent to Friedman actually 12,000 people, right? 3,800 are dead or wounded, and it can send more. It can send 30,000. It can send even more because it's a dictatorship, right? And nobody's going to say no to this. So it doesn't have problems like, you know, it doesn't face human shortages. It doesn't face ammo shortages. It's still on the move. Yes, it's doing poorly, but it's still on the move. Like, you know, it's still attaining some small victories. So to me, this is completely unclear why suddenly in January 2025, Russia would say, yeah, you know what? I've captured this place over here with a lot of lithium, but now I'm gonna stop. You know, I'm gonna stop and take a little pause. Why? What would be your incentive? I have no clue. Maybe I don't know something, but to me this is completely not obvious. If you're attaining your goals, even at such a pace, and you conquer territory and you conquer resources, not just territory, but also resources that are critical, why would you stop? So on this note, I'll make this rhetorical because I'm sorry, I don't know why somebody would want to stop. And generally, to sum it up, I think Friedman's interview with Zelensky was really appropriate in terms of timing, in terms of messaging, and in terms of everything. Like, you know, it was really good. It was really, really good. It was a great job. I think one of the best interviews by Zelensky because he was in his office. He felt comfortable. He spoke the language he wanted to speak. He understood what Friedman was saying and could respond accordingly, you know? And this is great because at the end of the day, the number one goal of this interview isn't to criticize Friedman or to do this. It's about relaying messages and accomplishing goals. And the goal was accomplished. The audience and the messages were clear. So I think it was a
And
success.
to get people to hear Zelensky's voice directly, people who perhaps have never listened to his speech before, people who felt allergic to it, avoided it, been not interested, his voice will have been heard by potentially many, many hundreds of thousands of people. This video has already racked up 2 million views. We have to assume that not everyone in that audience is in our bubble and you know listens to his daily outputs. There'll be a lot of people who'll be listening to this going, hang on a second, this is not quite the guy who I thought he was.
Exactly. And that is the point.
Lesia, we'll pick this one up in our next
Yes.
episode for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.